Welcome to Crime Soup Podcast. I'm your host, Kaylee Carter.
And I'm Hannah.
And this week we'll be discussing a string of rapes and murders in Kansas City, Missouri between 1973 and 1993 that can all be attributed to the same man. This is the story of the Kansas City Strangler. Between 1977 and 1990, Kansas City police had an unprecedented number of murdered women and girls on their hands, whose cases remained unsolved. In that 13-year span, there were 72 open cases of femicide. In 1990, police tried to organize each of the murders by the killer's MO, geographical location, and timeline, and they noticed significant patterns. The most glaring similarity between most of the women and girls found murdered during this time period was prostitution. 54 of the 72 victims, which is 75%, had been almost certainly involved in prostitution at the time of their deaths. Of those 54 victims that were involved in prostitution, 42 of them seemed to be victims of a serial killer, except police noticed 6 distinct MOs, methods of operation, that suggested 6 different killers, all operating in the same city. The 6 different theorized killers were described as the following. Number 1, the Troost Avenue Killer from 1977 to 1982. 7 women and girls all between the ages of 17 and 21. Most were known to stroll Troost Avenue as prostitutes. Most were found nude, molested, and strangled. Most were black, one was white. 2. The Tied Up Murders, 1980 to 1984. 9 women and girls between 15 and 26 years old, all found with their hands tied. All were black, all were strangled. Most were found naked from the waist down but were not molested. Most were known prostitutes. 3. The Avenue Mutilator from 1982 to 1989. 10 women and girls between 16 and 31 years old. All were suspected prostitutes or homeless people on Independence Avenue or Main Street. All were white. All were killed during warm weather months. Most were discarded in a river. None were strangled. Most were stabbed, beaten, or burned. The Downtown Victims, 1986. 4 women between 23 and 60 years old. All worked downtown. All were found strangled with clothing or a towel around their necks. 5. The Main Street Victims, from 1986 to 1987. 5 women between 19 and 32. All were white. All were believed to be prostitutes who strolled Main Street. All were drug addicts. And 6. The Gillum Park Strangler, from 1989 to 1990. 7 women between 21 and 35 years old. All were black, all were strangled, all were found in the Midtown area, all used crack cocaine, all were found nude and sexually assaulted, all were either suspected prostitutes or exchanged sexual favors for crack. As you can see, police tried to sort each of these unsolved murders into 6 seemingly distinct categories based on where the women were likely picked up from, where they were found, and their causes of death. When asked about the 9 victims who were assigned to the tied-up murders, Sergeant John Perry, a criminal investigative analyst for the Kansas City Police Department, stated, "When we look at tying up a victim, we have to differentiate between functional tying and bondage tying. Functional tying of the hands simply keeps them from moving or dangling once the person is dead, while a bondage type of tying connotes sexual gratification." Perry stated that these 9 victims were tied up, more functionally than sexually, insinuating that the killer was just trying to make moving and discarding the bodies easier.
So I think we missed this when we were doing episode 1 with Debbie Grabber. I think a lot of people with Debbie Grabber's case jumped to the conclusion that she was tied up for sexual gratification, that it was part of like BDSM. But now, like after doing this episode, I'm wondering if she was tied up just because they knew that they were going to have to move her lifeless body a distance to discard her. And it's just a lot easier to discard and move dead weight if you have all of the limbs tied up.
But the reason it was weird that she was tied up is because of the bondage tying between Debbie's mom and her girlfriend Kat. And that became suspicious. So they could have tied her up simply for the purpose of moving her body because it would have been easier to have her tied up. But maybe they did it in a way that they knew how, which was was bondage tying.
Which maybe was damning. But this is just something I hadn't really thought about a ton before this episode, was that sometimes tying up someone happens maybe after they're dead just because you need to be able to move them more easily. I don't know. I just hadn't thought about it before.
Yeah.
I've never had to think about what I would do with a dead body.
Never in my whole life. Thank God. When asked about the 10 victims who were assigned to the Avenue Mutilator, Captain Gary Buzzkirk, commander of the homicide unit, explained serial killers often mutilate their victims, seeking to depersonalize them and make identification of the body more difficult, making the link between the women who were found burned and those who were stabbed and dumped in the Missouri River as logical. So this is weird to me because he wasn't depersonalizing their faces or their teeth or any identifying markers that would make them harder to identify. Wasn't he mutilating them on their intimate body parts?
Yeah, whenever I hear that a serial killer is mutilating someone, I assume that it's for some weird sadistic pleasure.
Yeah.
But he's trying to argue that some mutilations are to kind of obfuscate that person's identity, which I think also does happen, but
yeah,
I don't know how common it is.
And I feel like we hear about a lot of serial killers who have a lot of anger. And so they mutilate bodies. They stab women's uteruses or vulvas or breasts because they're angry about something, and they target those areas specifically. But I guess I didn't consider that depersonalization, like for identification purposes. But maybe they do. I don't know.
I don't think it is. I don't know what kind of glue he's huffing.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of glue they got out in Missouri.
I'll take 12. Sounds like a good time.
Just kidding. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking this analysis from 1990 is over 30 years old. So have any of these cases been solved? Were the police right? Were there really 6 different serial killers all active in Kansas City during these years?
Well, let's see how the police did. On April 13th, 1990, less than a week after KCPD released their theory about a Gillum Park strangler targeting black women who used crack cocaine, a 22-year-old black man named Rayshawn Jackson was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder after one of his surviving victims came forward and ID'd him, stating that he tried to offer her crack cocaine but became violent when she refused his offer, dragged her into some bushes, and assaulted her. She survived thanks to a passerby who intervened and scared him off. Jackson was convicted of only 6 murders, not 7 like the police theorized, but all 6 were correctly attributed to the same killer. The 7th woman, who wasn't one of Jackson's victims, was a 33-year-old woman named Brenda McCoy, whose murder Jackson denied having any knowledge of. Her murder case remains open and unsolved.
They did really well. The Kansas City Police Department did really well with grouping together all of the Gillum Park strangling victims. I would give them kudos for that one.
Yeah, we'll let him have that one.
They got 6 out of the 7 correct, which, what's 6 out of a 7? That's a passing grade.
Yeah, good job, guys. From the peanut gallery over here.
Okay, so 1 serial killer down.
5 to go. In 1994, the murder of 18-year-old Angela Donald, who was originally assigned to the Avenue Mutilator, turned out to be the victim of an unrelated killer named Rodney Marlett, who pleaded guilty to manslaughter in 1996. In 2003, one of the young women who had originally been assigned to the tied-up murders, 22-year-old Dorothy Fisher, turned out to be the victim of an unrelated killer named Dawood Abdulmalik. Abdulmalik was convicted with significant DNA evidence found under Fisher's fingernails, but he hasn't been linked to any other murdered women in the area.
They thought that Angela Donald was a victim of the Avenue Mutilator, but she wasn't. And then they thought Dorothy Fisher might be a part of the tied-up murders because they found her bound, but she was also just part of an unrelated killing. So they've just got a couple of standalone murders, but we still got a lot more that are kind of unaccounted for.
Yeah, why are there so many murders in Kansas City, Missouri? What's going on over there? What's in the water? And then only one more killer was ever identified, but his killing spree proved to be the most erratic and the most difficult to trace, and he was dubbed the Kansas City Strangler. The Kansas City Strangler had 12 verifiable murder victims due to DNA found at the crime scenes, but it's possible he's guilty of more rapes and murders where his DNA just wasn't recovered. We're going to walk you through each of his crimes in chronological order and analyze how this serial killer evolved over time and discuss how the police failed in their duties to protect the public from this monster. Murder victim number 1 was 17-year-old Stacy Swafford. Stacy was last seen alive by her parents around Easter 1977, but she lived on the streets making money as a prostitute. Her nude body was found April 17, 1977, in a vacant lot near 45th Street and Euclid Avenue. Her cause of death was strangulation. There were bruise marks around her neck and a white cloth was tied around her wrist. Police initially conjectured that Stacy was the victim of someone targeting prostitutes that strolled Troost Avenue, but Stacy's killer has only verifiably been linked to one other victim from their list of 7. The other 5 were not attributed to the Kansas City Strangler. Okay, and the cloth around her wrist is weird. What do you think that was about?
At first I was like, maybe the cops just don't know what a scrunchie is. They're like, what is this?
Some kind of weird sex thing? Kids.
No. So I don't know why they would say cloth. My guess is that she was probably bound at some point with maybe a makeshift piece. When they say cloth, maybe they meant a piece of clothing. Maybe it was like a ripped up piece of her shirt or her pants or something. And then my guess is that the reason it was only on one wrist is that maybe her binding just came loose, like he dumped her body and it wasn't a good enough knot.
Maybe she was tied to something specifically by that wrist or together in some way and he just cut it before he dumped her, but that wouldn't make sense. I don't know. Murder victim number 2 was 15-year-old Gwendolyn Kazine, who was also a prostitute known to stroll Troost Avenue. Despite being killed by the same man, most everything else about Gwendolyn's murder was different than Stacy Swafford's. First of all, Gwendolyn was black. She was also 2 years younger than Stacy. She was found fully clothed except for her shoes. She was found in the alley behind a residential building, and her wrists and neck were wrapped in wire. Also, Gwendolyn's murder was almost 3 years later and 4 miles away.
She's a couple years younger, right? So he's still targeting girls. And it seems like maybe he's improving his MO in the sense that he's using wire to bind her. And I'm wondering if with Stacy, that, like I said, that piece of cloth on her wrist maybe was his attempt to try and bind her, but he improvised and he failed and it just came loose. Where did he get wire though? Do you think he brought wire with him?
I imagine he did. I bet he was just testing to see which worked better.
I also think it's weird that she was found fully clothed except for her shoes. Why? Did he redress her? Did he take off her shoes, take off her clothes, put her clothes back on, and then where did the shoes go?
Was she sexually assaulted?
Yes. So 11 of the 12 victims in total were all sexually assaulted. So there was only one that he didn't sexually assault, and we'll get to her later.
Obviously, he does not have an established MO. He doesn't have an established way he likes to do things, which makes him really hard to track so far. So.
And it's 3 years later. So,
yeah.
this is 3 years after Stacy's murder. So I'm just wondering, one, what empowered him to kill Stacy in the first place? Did something happen? Was it an angry killing? Was it just a killing of opportunity? Why he killed her in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a common question for everyone, why?
Mm-hmm.
But then what was he doing for the 3 years between Stacy's murder and Gwendolyn's murder? Was he killing other people and he just hasn't been linked to those murders? Was he just mentally doing fine and he's like, I don't need to kill anyone, I'm doing great?
Maybe he was riding the high from that first murder for those 3 years, and when that runs out, he decided to do it again. I also imagine that it probably freaked him out, in the way that that you could get totally caught from something like that. And so he was laying low because he wanted to be careful about being caught. So once he established that he was in the clear, and 3 years is a pretty good time to establish that you're in the clear, I feel like, he decided to try it again. Murder victim number 3 was 17-year-old Margaret Miller, another young black girl whose strangled body was found in a field near 37th Street and Garfield Avenue on May 9th, 1982. Another 2 years after his last victim in 1980, Miller was also working as a prostitute on Troost Avenue, but unlike Gwendolyn, her hands were not bound and she was only wearing shoes and socks.
So he has some trends, he's obviously targeting underage girls, right?
Yeah.
So he's targeting underage girls, some black, some white. They're all involved in prostitution, and but I can kind of understand why the police were having trouble necessarily linking these, because sometimes they're fully nude, sometimes they're fully clothed, sometimes they have no shoes, sometimes they have nothing but shoes. Do you think he was messing with them? He read in the newspapers, the police were completely confused. Like, why does Gwendolyn Kazine not have any shoes? I actually heard one theory was that the police in the beginning thought that maybe he was a foot fetishist. And I bet he read that and was like, I might be a serial killer, but I am no foot fetishist. And so he like killed Margaret and left nothing but the shoes.
That very well might be the case. But
like, I think this was purposeful. I think he read like, oh, they're gonna link me if I take away the shoes every time. So this time I'm gonna do the opposite and leave nothing but the shoes.
Maybe that is super possible. But I also wonder if, because sometimes I feel like we give a lot of credit to the reasons that serial killers do certain things. And so we read into it a ton. And and maybe the only thing connecting them, and that's why we haven't found as many serial killers as we should have found by now, I feel like, in general, overarchingly, is because we read into it too much and we don't just consider them to be erratic and kind of nonsensical in their behavior sometimes as well. Like, we only have type A personality serial killers. That's the only ones we found because they're relatively predictable. I'm sure there are lots of type B personality serial killers that we haven't found because they're erratic, hard to track. They don't have really rigorous or strict schedules or ways of doing things, and that just makes them really hard to find. Murder victim number 4 was Catherine Berry, a 34-year-old white woman who was found strangled behind a city parks building March 14, 1986, 4 years after Margaret Miller. Berry had been a federal employee working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and her fingerprints were on file. She was found naked except for a nylon stocking around her neck that was used to strangle her. She had paranoid schizophrenia, which included delusions and hallucinations. When she was murdered, she was destitute, living in the streets after choosing not to take her medication, believing they were actually poison and she wasn't really sick. Unlike all of the Kansas City Strangler's previous victims, Berry was not a prostitute, but she lived in a downtown hotel used regularly by prostitutes.
Hers was the only body that he tried to conceal, and she was the only one that wasn't a prostitute. And I don't know if those two things are linked, but according to her family, she had a mental breakdown after the birth of her third child, and she refused to take her medication because she had a reoccurring delusion that they were poisoned, that people were trying to poison her. And her family, they said that they tried to get her help, but ultimately there was nothing they could do since she was an adult. And so she ended up getting picked up by the Kansas City Strangler, I think because she would live in hotels, like really cheap hotels, ones that prostitutes often frequented, which is also where, unfortunately, the Kansas City Strangler was frequenting, and she was known to get rides from strangers, and she would hitchhike. But her body was found underneath a piece of plywood, and so I think originally they didn't link her to some of the other murders because none of his other victims he tried to actually conceal. He just left them out in the open.
That is weird that he specifically tried to conceal her, and also at first glance it does seem weird that she's like twice the age of his other victims so far, but at the same time,
it literally doubled. So his previous one was 17, it doubled.
Yeah.
And it was 4 years later. 4 years later, and the age doubled. So I can understand why the police didn't link these.
Yeah.
Because they seem like different MOs.
But it does make sense not connecting because Catherine was really vulnerable. If she's a paranoid schizophrenic and she has hallucinations and delusions, she would probably be extremely vulnerable. Murder victim number 5 was Naomi Kelly, a 23-year-old Black woman found strangled August 16, 1986, 5 months later. She was originally assigned to the downtown victims by police because she went to school downtown, was known to be involved in prostitution, and was found with a towel around her neck. Kelly was a student at Capital City Business College who attended classes downtown, but people close to her told police she strolled Troost Avenue trying to make ends meet. Her older sister Bessie said that Naomi was a quiet person who kept to herself, but she was taking business courses trying to better her life and the lives of her 2 children. Murder victim number 6 was Debbie Blevins, a 32-year-old white woman who worked as a prostitute on Main Street and was addicted to drugs. She was found strangled on the evening of Thanksgiving near the Hyde Park Christian Church, only 3 months after Naomi Kelly. She was found completely nude and the first of 3 victims to have foreign hairs found with their bodies that eventually helped police link the victims.
His killings are getting closer and closer together.
It reminds me of a Criminal Minds episode where the killer slowly descends into chaos and starts killing more and more closer together, like more rapidly, like losing control. Murder victim number 7 was Ann Barnes, a 36-year-old white woman who worked as a housekeeper at St. Mary's Hospital, but also as an exotic dancer and prostitute. Her nude, strangled body was found downtown on April 17, 1987, about 5 months after Debbie Blevins was discovered.
So back in 1990, when the police first started to organize all of these crimes into different categories, Ann Barnes wasn't even on their list of strangulation victims, and I don't know why. I don't have an explanation for it unless it was just a technical error, but for some reason she wasn't on their original list.
She was also found downtown, right? Which was different than everybody else so far.
Well, no, but they had a whole category called the downtown victims.
Yeah.
I just wonder if there was something about her that maybe because she was too old? Was it because she was 36?
Maybe she was 36 and maybe she was an exotic dancer, which opened up a different array of potential perpetrators. So maybe they didn't immediately put her in the same category because it could have been somebody who frequented the club she worked at. I mean, that's a whole different category altogether. So murder victim number 8 was Kelly Ford, a 20-year-old white woman who is known to stroll Main Street and was addicted to drugs. She was found strangled June 9th, 1987 at the foot of a bluff, completely nude except for a white sock on her right foot.
And also, so Kelly Ford, this is only 2 months after the previous murder. So
Yep.
He went down from 5 months down to 2 months. So
also, she was completely nude except for a white sock on her right foot. So this makes me think that he was just ripping clothes off and sometimes shoes would come off and sometimes they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And he didn't care. So that's what that makes me think of. It totally was erratic because it was. He was taking their clothes off. That's my assessment.
Yeah. So I have 2 theories. That's definitely possible. My other theories were that whether or not his shoes came off were just dependent on what the women were wearing.
Yes.
Because, whenever you're wearing a dress or when you're wearing a skirt, you can pull that off and your shoes can stay on.
Yep.
But if they were wearing pants, then it's a lot harder to get their pants off. So you'd have to take off their shoes, take off their pants, right?
Yep.
And also another one of my theories was that some of the women, the ligature around their neck were shoelaces.
Yeah.
So maybe he was just using them. It seems like he went completely unprepared. He was so confident that he could get away with this that he didn't even take ligatures of any kind with him, except maybe with Gwendolyn, he took wire.
Yeah.
But with the other women, most of them were found with pantyhose, unnamed cloth. I don't know where he was getting towels from, and then shoestrings. So I think he was mostly improvising.
It actually would be pretty smart to not bring anything with you.
Yeah.
As a murderer, because that's only going to link you to the case. So only using things that you have available is really erratic and potentially problematic for you in your pursuit to freaking murder somebody. But it helps not place you at the scene. Victim number 9 was Angela Mayhew, a 19-year-old white woman who was an unknown prostitute working on Main Street, just like Kelly Ford. Her death came 3 months later, September 12th, 1987. She was found on the side of the road, completely clothed except for her socks and shoes. Police also didn't find any evidence of sexual assault, but they did find human hairs that they then took into evidence.
So this is his one victim that doesn't seem to have been sexually assaulted, and she's found completely clothed, which again is probably why the police didn't maybe link her to some of his other victims.
And she was found on the side of the road, right? Almost like he just pushed her out of the car?
Maybe, yeah.
Which is also weird.
Yeah, my first theory, I didn't even think about him pushing her out of a car. My first thought was that maybe the reason she wasn't sexually assaulted is because he got interrupted.
Yeah.
Like maybe he wasn't able to get to that point because there was a witness or someone nearby, and so he just kind of disposed of her and then didn't get a chance to finish.
Or there was another theory that she was fighting back and he had to kill her, I guess. So
something weird happened in this one, and we don't know what it was.
Exactly. Victim number 10 was Sheila Ingold, a 36-year-old white woman who worked as a prostitute on Troost Avenue, whose body was discovered in a van parked outside of a repair shop on November 3rd, 1987, less than 2 months after Angela Mayhew was killed. Sheila's injuries weren't immediately apparent, but the medical examiner testified later that Ingold was either strangled or suffocated, which is different than before if it's not immediately strangulation.
Yeah, hers was another weird one. She also, you could argue, her body was kind of concealed. I don't know. It seems like the van that she was found in must have been unlocked, and he just saw it as an opportunity, as like somewhere private to kill her.
Or maybe she knew that it was unlocked because she worked as a prostitute and maybe took clients there. So.
Oh, yeah. That could be true too. But yeah, it's weird that they couldn't immediately tell. With all the other ones, there was always something obviously around their neck, or they had bruising, but her, they weren't really sure. And now it's less than 2 months between murders.
Yeah, so he's definitely descending into chaos right now. Victim number 11 was Carmeline Hibbs, another prostitute known to frequent Main Street and use drugs. Her body found a month and a half after Sheila Ingold's. She was 30 years old, and her body was found strangled in a parking garage. She was fully clothed except for her shoes. She left behind a 5-year-old daughter. Like, it's just one thing after another. Like, there's so many victims right now. Do we know if the Kansas City Police Department was like freaking out? Were they worried? Was it just another prostitute off the street to them and they didn't care? Like,
yeah, I don't know what was going on inside the police department and how they were reacting, or whether or not they were even taking these seriously. And also, I mean, there's some people who really depressingly believe, and I'm not sure how far off they are, that police don't feel a sense of urgency to convict people who kill prostitutes, because it's possible that to the police, it's almost a bonus for them. That when these women who are abusing drugs and are involved in prostitution die, that it's actually less work for them. Because if they don't go through the trouble of investigating it, they can kind of just wipe their hands clean of it and be like, well, that's one less streetwalker or one less street person that I have to deal with.
I really, really hope that wasn't the case in this scenario, but I know that that's a general belief.
One of the alternative nicknames for the Kansas City Strangler that I didn't want to use in this episode because I hate it so much, because I feel like it's absolutely abhorrent, is some people refer to him as the trash collector.
Wow.
His actual day job was as a trash collector, like he worked for garbage disposal, right? But they were also using it as a dual meaning of like he was cleaning up the streets.
That's disgusting. I'm sick of men dehumanizing and vilifying prostitution when they're the ones who create the demand, first of all. And secondly, women are doing it out of desperation to feed themselves or their families. And
it's like that old trope of like, men talk about how if women aren't virgins, that they're unclean. And it's like, who made them dirty?
Who's making them?
You!
Yeah. If you touch a woman and that makes her unclean, then maybe you should look at yourself.
Exactly. Oh my God.
Finally, victim number 12 was Connie Luther, a 29-year-old white woman whose nude body was found strangled in a snowdrift on January 11th, 1993. She had a shoestring tied around her neck, and an investigation revealed that she also worked as a prostitute on Main Street.
There's a huge gap between 1988 and 1993, which is really weird. My immediate thought would be that what's common with serial killers like this who suddenly go off the grid and then come back is that they were incarcerated. They like sometimes get arrested on completely unrelated charges. That would be my first thought.
What was happening in his personal life? Like, did he get married? Was there some type of change in his life that made it not as easy for him to do this? But yeah, incarceration is my first guess too. Altogether, all of the victims of the Kansas City Strangler were prostitutes except one. 9 were white, 3 were black, and their ages ranged from 15 to 36, and only one wasn't sexually assaulted. Research on serial killers shows that they generally don't stop killing until they die or are imprisoned, which is why it's odd that the Kansas City Strangler seemingly stopped killing in 1993. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received $1 million federal grant to help close local cold cases, which is how all of the DNA found with these 12 victims' bodies was able to be tested. In 2004, the results connected it all to one man, Lorenzo Gilyard Jr. Lorenzo Gilyard Jr. was a Kansas City local with an extensive criminal history. Gilyard stopped going to school after the 10th grade, never finishing high school, but married one of his high school classmates when they were both 18. In 1969, Gilyard was accused of going to an acquaintance's home, striking her in the head with a flashlight and raping her. She identified Gilyard as her assailant. In 1972, prosecutors filed rape and assault charges against Gilyard for allegedly raping a woman who said she just knew him from chatting with him occasionally on the street. She said the rapist choked her into unconsciousness with a headscarf and pantyhose. The woman told police that when she came to, her assailant was scared that I was going to tell police and started telling me about himself, trying to scare me into not reporting what he had done. She later picked Gilyard's photo out of a police lineup.
Okay, so this is like a full 5 years before his first murder of Stacey Swafford, right? Because she was 77?
Yeah.
So it's already obvious to the people around him and to these women that he's assaulting that there's something seriously wrong with him and that he's dangerous.
Why was he never locked up? Like, he had done all of these things, and did he not spend time in jail?
No. He doesn't go to jail for the first time until 1974.
Yeah, let's tell them about that, actually. In 1973, Gilyard's wife filed for divorce after 5 years of marriage, saying that their relationship went downhill after they got married and that he physically and sexually abused her the entire marriage. In February of 1974, Gilyard was charged with raping a 25-year-old exotic dancer, but she ended up dropping the charges and accepted reconciliation outside of court. And then in July, he was charged with raping and beating his friend's 13-year-old sister, but had the charge changed to simply child molestation and only served 9 months in county jail.
Yeah, so he did all of that crap, which is more than most people would do in an entire lifetime.
Exactly.
In just a couple of years.
And he got a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, I absolutely hate that raping and beating his friend's 13-year-old sister was labeled child molestation.
That's aggravated sexual assault.
Yeah, no. Child molestation is completely different than what he did. And even then, only 9 months.
Only 9 months.
That's skimpy.
When I worked at the police department, I was in the special victims unit, right? And you would not believe how many people who were found guilty of child molestation or rape served no time in jail at all. They were on parole and they had to register as a sex offender, but that's it. They never served any time in jail, and you would not believe how many of them reoffended. So I don't understand why we don't put these people in prison.
So I'm trying to figure out if there's any kind of even bizarre reasoning. I'm trying to apply some sort of logic. And The best thing I can come up with is that they just don't think that child molestation is a violent threat worthy of being incarcerated.
I think that a lot of times we are scared to ruin the perpetrator's life because a lot of times these people seem really, really normal. And so it feels unreasonable to a lot of people to lock them up forever because they're just a normal guy and they just made a mistake. It could happen to anyone. If it can, then I'm really concerned because if anyone is capable of doing that, we have a larger issue. And then in 1977 is when the murder victims start piling up, about a year after he's released from county jail. After Margaret Miller was found killed in 1982, Gilyard went to prison on an unrelated burglary charge, and that's why there's a 4-year gap in his killing spree from 1982 to 1986. So you were right.
It's all coming together.
Yep, you were right. It was that he went to prison. In 1986, Gilyard started working at the same trash collection company as his father, eventually working his way up to supervisor, and by all accounts was loved by his coworkers and supervisors. Between 1986 and 1987, Gilyard killed 8 of his victims in quick succession, but he was considered a suspect in the 1987 murder of Sheila Ingold, which is when he provided a sample of his blood to police, which is what helped them match his DNA in 2004 when they got that federal grant.
Mm-hmm.
Lorenzo Gilyard had been accused of sexual deviancy and violence throughout his adult life by his wives, friends, female neighbors, and even strangers. He had proven time and time again that he wasn't going to stop. And we just let him go, over and over again.
So, in my unprofessional opinion, I don't think that sexual deviants can be rehabilitated. I think maybe children can, if you can rehabilitate them young enough. But adults like Lorenzo, I think he was going to continue to be violent and sexist until the day he died. And I think all of this could have been prevented if they had just listened to all of the women back in the late 60s and early 70s and taken the domestic violence seriously, if they had taken the rape charges seriously, if they had stopped giving him just slaps on the wrist and actually taken those things seriously and considered them to be more serious because they are serious, none of the rest of this would have happened.
I absolutely agree with you.
And I feel like that's a really common theme. Like, the more that you study serial killers and serial rapists like this, they start, quote unquote, small. I don't even want to phrase it that way, but they start small with usually domestic violence, right? And it's usually obvious to the women and girls in their lives that they are sexist and that they are violent, but apparently that doesn't get taken seriously, and that's what leads to things like this.
Absolutely agree. Yep, there were signs over and over again, and nobody did anything about it. Everybody just kept letting him go, and that's the reason he killed so many women.
So one last thing that I wanted to say about Gilyard, I just feel like his case in general illustrates a few common themes that most crime junkies are really familiar with, which we've already talked about, but I wanted to reiterate. Like, one, he targeted prostitutes and other vulnerable groups of people, which is a very common theme with serial killers. And he had a history of domestic violence or sexual deviancy and got little to no jail time, which we see time and time again. So I feel like if we want to try and solve these issues, we need to focus on these vulnerable groups of people, and we need to focus on paying more attention to sexual deviance and taking their crimes, even if you consider them to be petty crimes, more seriously.
I agree. Thanks for tuning in for this week's episode of Crime Soup Podcast. Be sure to find us on social media. We're on TikTok at Crime Soup Podcast and on Instagram and Twitter at crime_soup. We also have a cool new website at crimesouppodcast.com where you can listen to all past episodes and even buy your own Crime Soup merch. Let us know your thoughts about this case and be sure to catch us next week for an all-new episode. As always, stay safe and bon appetit.